Hi, I'm Bill from CJ Pony Parts.
And I'm Freddy with CJ Off-Road.
This is the 2018 F-150 we built for the Ford display at this year's SEMA show. Now, because of the rules of SEMA, we weren't allowed to show you this truck until it actually debuts at the show.
We've actually done a ton of work to this truck, including the main piece, which was this ReadyLIFT 7-inch lift kit. That way I custom powder coated to match the truck, and today we're going to show you how we installed it. This ReadyLIFT lift kit comes with everything you need to give your F-150 a 7-inch lift all the way around, and it's going to lift it with the use of spacers, cross members, heavy-duty steering knuckles, and a steering extension to maintain the factory ride quality. It also comes with a set of SST3000 rear shocks because the factory ones are way too short, so today we're going to install it on our 2018 F-150. For this installation, you're going to need quite a bit of tools. You're going to need some basic hand tools and some cutting tools as well. Before we get started with any work, we're going to get a measurement at all four corners of our factory ride height just so we know what we're starting with. Looks like we're at 38 1/4 up front and 41 1/8 in the rear. After you get your measurements, make sure that your wheels are straight and the steering wheel is locked, and then you can disconnect the battery. Okay, we have the truck up in the air and we took all four wheels off. Now we're going to remove both splash guards. Disconnect the ABS and brake line brackets from the knuckle and the frame. Disconnect the vacuum line on the four-wheel drive actuator. Locate the ABS wire connector in the engine compartment and unplug it. Pull on the red security tab to unlock it, and then disconnect it. Remove the ABS wire from all of its clips. Remove the tie rod. Remove both 21mm bolts holding on the brake caliper. Pull off the brake rotor. Remove the three 8mm bolts holding on the dust shield. Remove the axle nut cover. Remove the 12mm spindle nut. Grab an 18mm wrench and an 8mm socket to loosen the nut on the upper control arm. Now, our truck is so new that this ball joint isn't really set into the knuckle. If your truck was older, you would have to hit right here with a sledgehammer to separate the two, but because this truck has practically no mileage, it's just separating. Pull the steering knuckle towards the outside of the truck and remove the drive shaft. If your truck's a little bit older, you might need to hammer this out. Remove the three 8mm bolts holding on the vacuum actuator. Once you remove all three bolts, you can remove the actuator. With the vacuum actuator out of the way, we're going to remove the four 18mm bolts holding the hub to the knuckle. pull the hub off and set it aside. Remove the 21mm nut on the lower ball joint. And lower the knuckle. Remove the 18mm nut on the bottom of the sway bar end link. Next, remove both of the nuts on the bottom of the strut. They're a bit difficult to see, but there's 3 18mm nuts on top of the strut that you have to remove, and then you can remove the entire strut. We're going to remove both CV axles now. The strut can now be removed. We're going to use a pry bar to help us get it out. Now we're going to do everything that we just did on the passenger side. The lower control arm can now be removed. You're going to need a 27 and 21mm socket. With the lower control arms out of the way, we're going to remove this rear cross member with a 15mm wrench and 18 socket. We're going to disconnect the drive shaft from the differential, but before we do it, we're going to mark it just so we know how to reinstall it later. When we go to install this, we'll just line it up with this line, and it'll make it a lot easier. To make it easier to remove the bolts on the front of the drive shaft, I'm going to lock it in place by putting a wrench on the bolts on the rear part of the drive shaft. Then when I go to loosen the bolt, the drive shaft will lock. I'm going to hold the drive shaft as well as keeping the wrench back there to lock it, and now I can remove these bolts. We're about to remove the differential, but before we do it, we're going to support it with a transmission jack and then use the jack to slide it out. To make removing the differential a little bit easier, we're going to remove the 2 bolts holding on the steering rack so we can get some wiggle room out of it. We're going to start off on this bolt, which is a 24mm. You don't need to completely remove this bolt, just loosen it and then support the passenger side of the steering rack with a pole jack. With the differential supported, we're going to remove the 3 differential mounts. This top one's pretty difficult to get to. You're going to want to go through the engine compartment to get to it. To remove this bolt, you're going to jack up the passenger side of the steering rack, and that will give you clearance from the steering shaft. Then you can remove the bolt. Next, we're going to remove this mount on the differential with a 21mm socket. Just one more bolt now. Remove the 3rd bolt with an 18mm wrench. We have all the mounts disconnected on the differential. Now we're going to lower it about 1 inch, disconnect the vent tube, and then we'll get the differential out of there. Just simply pull off the vent tube from the differential, and now we can get this differential out of here. You will lose a little bit of fluid when removing this. Earlier we loosened up the steering rack just to give us more clearance to get the hardware out. Now we have to do a little bit of cutting, so I think it's a good idea to remove the steering rack just to keep it safe. There's 2 electrical connectors on the steering rack that you have to undo. Now we'll take out the second bolt. To completely remove the steering rack, you have to release the steering knuckle. We're going to put a mark on it so we know how to reinstall it. With the steering shaft marked, you can remove the 10mm bolt. Okay, we're ready to start cutting. There's 2 cuts we have to make. The first one is going to be on the driver's side crossmember bracket, and the other will be on the driver's side differential bracket. All right, we're going to make 2 lines on this crossmember bracket. We're going to measure 2 5/8 of an inch inside. Put a line there. We're going to do this on the other side of this crossmember bracket. Our second cut is going to be on this driver's side differential bracket. We're pretty much going to cut this straight in half and grind this section flush with the frame. All that's going to be left is this side of the bracket. We have all of our cuts made and everything's grinded down nicely. Now we're going to hit it with some black spray paint so it doesn't rust. All right, while your paint's drying, you're going to locate the driver's side differential drop bracket and thread in the rod end, and then you're going to make sure it's 1 1/4 inch away from the bung. So install it just like we have here on our drop bracket, and make sure the center of the rod end is 1 3/4 inch away from the bung. Then once you thread it in, you can install the set screw on the back, but don't tighten this just yet, just get it in place. Install the differential drop bracket with the provided 14mm Allen bolt and washer. You're going to thread this bolt in, but do not tighten it just yet. The passenger side differential drop bracket is installed next with the factory hardware. The kit comes with this vent tube extension that needs to be installed before we can install the differential. The differential can now be raised into the drop brackets. We're going to secure it with just a bolt and washer for right now. We're not going to use any nuts. With the differential in place, we can now connect the vent tube to the top of the differential. Just press it onto the barb. Next, we're going to install this bracket onto the differential mount and cross-member mount. Just like that. Install a nut and washer onto the differential mount bolt. Then install the crush tube and factory bolt. We're on the passenger side now, and we're going to install the differential mount bracket with the provided nut and washer. The sway bar drop brackets are going to be installed next with the provided hardware. Do the same thing on the driver's side. Things are starting to get a little heavy now. It's time to install the rear cross member. You're going to install this bolt through the sway bar bracket and then through the cross member. We have our bolt in on the passenger side. Now it's time to line up the driver's side. We're hitting, there we go. And she's through. Install a washer and nut on the bolts that you just put through the cross member. We're going to take the factory hardware for the cross member and install it through the frame pocket, through the ReadyLIFT cross member, and into the differential bracket. Install the provided bolt in the differential mount, then the nut and washer. We have the rear cross member installed. Now it's time for the showpiece of this kit, and that's the front cross member. The factory hardware is going to be used to hold this cross member in place. For the factory steering rack to work with the 7-inch lift, ReadyLIFT supplies a steering extension that installs onto the factory rack. Place the extension onto the rack, then install the locking bolt. You're going to torque this bolt to 165 inch-pounds. For proper steering alignment, when you install this extension assembly, make sure that this pinch bolt right here lines up perfectly with the notch on the extension shaft. We're going to lift the steering rack up and bolt it to our new cross member. We're going to raise up the driver's side of the steering rack and line up the steering extension with the rod end that we installed. And get the driver's side bolt installed too. With the steering rack installed, we're going to line up the steering extension with the factory steering shaft. We're going to install the factory pinch bolt into the intermediate shaft. Install the cam bracket and nut on the front of the cross member. Do the same thing on the rear, and make sure when you install these cam nuts, do not tighten these just yet, just get them hand loose. It's important to note when installing these cam nuts and brackets, don't fully tighten these just yet, just get them hand tight. Do the same thing for the passenger control arm. We're going to go back and tighten everything that we just installed to the proper torque spec. We have all the hardware torqued. Now we're going to install this skid plate underneath the differential. Once you get the bolts tightened, you can torque them to 35 foot-pounds. Find the marks that you put on your drive shaft and differential earlier and line them up. Then you're going to install the drive shaft spacer and install the 6 provided Allen bolts with thread locker. Once you get all the bolts threaded in, they all get torqued to 50 foot-pounds. The truck's starting to come together now, and the struts can be reinstalled along with the strut spacer. These only go on one way, and they are marked D for driver side and P for passenger side. You're going to secure the spacer to the strut with the provided nuts, and then use the factory nuts on top of the spacer. Each nut's going to get torqued to 35 foot-pounds. Place the strut into the upper strut mount and loosely install the top nuts to hold it in place. We have the strut secured up top. Now it needs to be secured on the bottom by lifting up the lower control arm. Install the factory nuts on the bottom. The CV axles can now be installed as well. To fully seat these axles, you're going to put a piece of wood right here on the axle and hit it with a hammer. All right, we have the steering knuckle in place. Now we're going to install the vacuum actuator on the axle. Things are starting to get a little heavy now. It's time to install the steering knuckles. Get it onto the lower ball joint on the lower control arm. Install the lower nut. Now you can install the hub. With the knuckle in place, we're going to install the hub and make sure the ABS sensor is at the top. And you're going to secure it with the factory hardware. The next part is going to be a little tricky. We have to line up the axle with the hub now and also get the upper knuckle attached to the upper ball joint. The axle nut can now be reinstalled. The axle nut then gets torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Reinstall the factory dust cap and use a 28mm socket to go around it and get it seated. Reinstall the 3 bolts for the vacuum actuator. Torque all 3 vacuum actuator bolts to 5 foot-pounds. Install the factory dust shield back onto the hub. The brakes can now be installed as well. Install the outer tie rod into the knuckle. With this installed, we're going to go back and tighten everything on this suspension. Install the brake line bracket onto the knuckle with the provided bolt. While you're doing the brake line, you can install the ABS wire on the knuckle as well. Connect the vacuum lines on the vacuum actuator. Install the brake line extension bracket onto the frame. The bracket on the brake hose then gets attached to the extension bracket. Run the ABS wire back up into the engine compartment and reattach it. There's one more major component still missing, and that's the sway bar, so we're going to reinstall it with the factory bracket onto the drop brackets and the lower control arm. The final step on the front part of the lift is put the wheels on and put the truck on the ground so you can adjust the cam bolts on the front cross member. You're going to set them to full inboard to get the most amount of camber out of them, and then torque them to 150 foot-pounds. And once you get all forward torque, your installation for the front is finished and you can move to the rear. Okay, we're finished with the front. Now we're onto the rear. We have the truck up in the air with the wheels off. The first thing we're going to do is disconnect this brake hose bracket on the frame. Grab a 10mm socket and remove this bolt right here on the frame. This clip right here should also be removed. It's going to give your brake lines a lot more play. We have the rear end supported with 2 pole jacks. Now we're going to disconnect both shocks. The bottom shock nut is an 18mm and the nut is a 15. Now we'll remove the top shock bolt. Once you have everything loose, you can remove the shock. We have the shocks removed, and now we can loosen but not remove the nuts on the driver's side U-bolt. We're going to continue to lower the rear so we can fit our new block in. Install our new block and raise the rear back up. Make sure you line it up with the bosses on the leaf spring. We have the ReadyLIFT block installed. The factory U-bolts are way too short, so we have longer U-bolts to go along with the block. With the U-bolts installed, you can install the U-bolt retainer and then the nuts. You don't need to make these tight just yet, just get them on by hand. We had the blocks installed on the driver's side, so we'll install the U-bolts on this side as well. Then the retainer and nuts. Just like on the passenger side, we're going to snug these up, but do not fully tighten them just yet. At this point, the shocks can be installed. We're going to be installing ReadyLIFT's SST3000 shocks. These are much longer than the factory shocks, so they don't blow out, and they'll offer better off-road performance. Install the shock into the frame using the factory hardware. Extend the shock down, line it up with the axle, and put the factory hardware through it. Make sure you have the body of the shock on the axle, not on the frame. Once you get the shock in place, you can tighten all the hardware. Do the same thing to the passenger side shock. Install the brake hose drop bracket to the frame using the factory bolt. Then attach the brake hose bracket to the drop bracket with the provided bolts. We have everything in place. We're going to lower these pole jacks and then put the wheels on the truck. And then we're going to put the truck on the ground and fully torque the U-bolts and shocks. Okay, we have the truck on the ground. Now we're going to go underneath it and torque the U-bolt nuts to 120 foot-pounds and the shock hardware to 60 foot-pounds. Okay, our ReadyLIFT suspension lift is installed. Our truck is definitely a lot higher and it's looking pretty good, but it looks like it skipped leg day, so a nice set of wheels and tires is on the way. To do this lift, you'll really want to set aside an entire weekend, and you'll need a good amount of tools, and before you know it, you'll be heading off-road.